Was Ellen White a prophet or a plagiarist?
And the evidence is that I'm finding that I'm struggling with things like, her plagiarism, she plagiarized. Many people don't know that. Without saying that she was borrowing or taking from other writers. And so that was a big one for me. The plagiarism thing, it's just overwhelming that this woman made people believe that God gave her a message that she clearly took from another man-made mind, all the while claiming that it was from God and given to her in vision, much of which she said, I was shown, I was saw, or received it from her angel, accompanying angel. My goodness, when you get into the testimonies are full of them.
All right, friends, welcome back to Ken's Object Lessons. Now, Mark Finley has posted a video, I think like 2-3 days back, and he's responding to Ryan Day's accusations of the writings of Ellen G. White as plagiarism or as false writings. But is that so? So Mark Finley goes an extra mile to explain and defend the writings of Ellen White, to show us that her writings are divinely inspired of God. They are not false writings, but they are straight from God. So let us watch the video and see what he's talking about, and please try to understand it. Take time to understand what he's talking about and how he defends the writings of Ellen White, so that you can also know and be certain that indeed her writings were divinely inspired. So let us watch the video and let me know in the comment section what you think.
And she said, "Brethren and sisters, I commend to you this book." Now, throughout the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there have been repeated attacks on the writings of Ellen White. One of the major attacks has been the idea that she plagiarized, that these messages weren't from God at all, but she copied those messages from other writers of her day. In other words, what she wrote and said did not come from a divine source, but other human sources, and that she was inconsistent, and some would even say dishonest, in using these sources. Now, I want to look at that from both a legal and a practical standpoint. First, it's interesting to notice that Ellen White herself acknowledged that she made use of literary sources. This is not something that she hid. In the introduction to one of her most popular books called The Great Controversy, Ellen White writes, Great Controversy, introduction, page Roman numeral 12. She says, "In some cases, where a historian has so grouped together efforts as to afford, in brief, a comprehensive view of the subject, or has summarized details in a convenient manner, his words have been quoted, but in some instances, no specific credit has been given. Since the quotations are not given for the purpose of citing that writer as authority, but because his statement affords a ready and forcible presentation of the subject. In narrating the experience and views of those carrying forward the work of reform in our own time, similar use has been made of their published works." So Ellen White says, yes, I have borrowed from other writers where it's enhanced what God has revealed to me. So the question is not, did she borrow? She did at times. Now, the amount that she borrowed is infinitesimally low when you look at the great volume of her writings, over 100,000, pages of writing. And when you look at the great volume, the amount that she borrowed is low, but she did borrow at times. Ellen White's use of other authors was not limited to historical or geographical material, but included other subject areas as well. Now, research has found that she has enriched her writings with choice expressions from her reading more extensively than sometimes we've known before. But some authors say that if you look at the total amount, it's maybe 2%. Others have said, well, in some books it may be 11%, and one author wrote that in one chapter it might be as much as 30%. Now, let's say it was fairly high in some chapters, take one chapter and say, okay, that was 20, 30% in a chapter that she borrowed, not copied word for word, but borrowed thoughts, borrowed ideas. Was that plagiarism? Attorney Lewis Walton makes an interesting point. He is a specialist in this area of American law, and he talks about plagiarism. And he says that at least in 1845, 2 years before Ellen White began to write, that Judge Joseph Story had a classic case in the United States about plagiarism. Justice Story decided various district circuit court cases. And in those days, in the 1840s, they'd ride horseback and they'd go from district court to district court to district court. Well, up in Massachusetts, Judge Joseph Story was looking at a case called Emerson versus Davies, a case that involved alleged copyright infringement. That case took place, again, 2 years before Ellen White started writing. And Judge Story said this. He said, "The use of someone else's literary property is proper if one is doing his own or her own creative work." Now let me quote from that case way back in 1845 that Judge Story speaks about. He says, "Every book in literature, science, and art borrows and must necessarily borrow. No man creates a new language for himself, at least if he be a wise man. The thoughts of every man are more or less a combination of what other men have thought and expressed, although they may be modified, exalted, or improved by his own genius or reflection." Now, the controlling legal principle, according to Judge Joseph Story, was this: did the writer who borrowed someone else's phraseology do something with it? Did they create something better, something bigger? Did they use this just as a basis to enlarge, enrich their own thoughts? Now, Attorney Walton continues, "It's not plagiarism to use a portion of someone else's work and improve it with your own creativity. Indeed, inclusion of research material is usually deemed to be scholarship, and the more sources, the better." Well, here's another interesting fact. Ellen White often recommended the books that she had read from her library. When you got 1,200 books in your library, and she was a voracious reader, when you got those 1,200 books, you're reading this and that. And some of the critics who claim Ellen White copied, they're saying, oh, she copied, she did this clandestinely in a way and secretly. Not at all. She talks about use of literary sources in the book Great Controversy Introduction that we've read, and she recommends the books. Let me give you an example. There's a book called Life Sketches of the Apostle Paul by authors Coney Barrenhausen. Ellen White advertised that book. She encouraged people to read it, and she used some of it as a basis for her writing her book called Acts of the Apostles. There's an author called Hannah, another called March, that she used as a basis in some chapters, a small percentage, for the book Desire of Ages. But she talks about that. She discusses the fact. Now, the question really becomes, how does God inspire a prophet? God gives the prophet visions or dreams. God also inspires the mind of the prophet. But then the prophet has to write in the context of their background, the context of their words, the messages that God has given. So as Ellen White reads, as she pores over her library, she reads certain sentences, certain paragraphs, certain concepts that the Lord has revealed to her in visions and dreams, and she begins to write. She modifies those sentences. She adapts those sentences. She uses some of that language to express what God has revealed to her. Now, the issue here is not the process that God uses in inspiration. God's omniscient. We can allow God to use whatever process he desires. But it is not the process, but the product. So currently I'm reading a book on the life of Christ called Desire of Ages. And every chapter, every page is filled with the beauty and the love and the character of Christ. And it inspires me as I read it. Attorney Vincent L. Remick was a specialist in patent, trademark, and copyright issues. And he was retained by the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists to evaluate charges against Ellen White of plagiarism. Now, it's interesting. Attorney Remick is a Catholic. He spent more than 300 hours researching 1,000 relevant cases in American legal history. He concluded his 27-page legal opinion with an unequivocal declaration. Let me read to you from this Catholic attorney, Remick. He says, Ellen White was not a plagiarist. Her works did not constitute copyright infringement piracy. Now, Remick points out several factors that the critics of Ellen White's writings have overlooked, that they have failed to take into account. He lists three things about copyright infringement and plagiarism. Number one, he says, her selections stayed well within the legal boundaries of fair use. So there's a law called the fair use law. In other words, you can read the writings of another. You can use some of those thoughts, ideas, concepts, language, as long as you enrich it, and that's called the fair use law. So Attorney Remick says Ellen White stayed within the fair use law. Secondly, Ellen White used the writings of others, but in a way that she used them, she made them uniquely her own. That's exactly what Judge Joseph Story said in 1845, and Attorney Remick says the same thing. So you read it, but you shape it. You make it your own. Thirdly, we mentioned this, but Remick mentions it as well. Ellen White urged her readers to get copies of the sum of the very book she made use of, demonstrating that she did not attempt to conceal the fact of her use of literary sources and that she had no intention to defraud or supersede the works of any other author. So these points are very, very critical. Herb Douglas, Ph.D., Dr. Herbert Douglas, Ph.D., makes this telling comment about Ellen White's work in his book, Messenger of the Lord. He says, Ellen White did not copy wholesale or without discrimination. What she selected or did not select and how she altered what she selected reveals that she used literary sources, get this, to amplify or to state more forcefully her own transcending themes. She was the master, not the slave of her sources. That's Herb Douglas in the book Messenger of the Lord, page 461. Rather than be skeptical or critical about the process the Holy Spirit uses to communicate God's message to his people, study the product. An omniscient God can choose any method he wishes. If you find yourself skeptical or questioning the writings of Ellen White, rather than take the words of her critic, rather than listen to the skeptics, why not take a book like Steps to Christ and with an open heart and an honest mind read it? Why not take a book like The Story of Redemption that speaks of Jesus on every page and read it? I'd like to give you a challenge. Right now, I am reading a book called The Desire of Ages. It's an amazing book on the life of Christ. In fact, it's reported that one of the librarians in the Library of Congress recommended Desire of Ages as the most outstanding book on the life of Christ. I'd like to give you a challenge. If you have any questions about the inspiration of the writings of Ellen White, I'd like you to read the first chapter. We're going to put a link in here at the bottom of our program, and we're going to challenge you. Click on that link. The first chapter is entitled God with Us. Let me read you just a couple paragraphs. See if God speaks to you through these paragraphs. See if God enriches your life through these paragraphs. See if God draws you close to Jesus through these paragraphs. Rather than listen to the critics, rather than listen to the skeptics and read what they've written, why not come with an honest heart, with an open mind? Why not come with a sincere spirit? Why not come with a genuine desire to understand truth? Why not let God speak to you through the modern-day gift of prophecy? Let me ask you, do these two paragraphs exalt Ellen White, or do they exalt Jesus? I read Desire of Ages, page 25, and two paragraphs. In stooping to take himself humanity, Christ revealed a character opposite of the character of Satan, but he stepped still lower in the path of humiliation. Quote, being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross, Philippians 2:8. As the high priest laid aside his gorgeous pontifical robes and officiated in the white linen dress of the common priest, so Christ took the form of a servant and offered sacrifice, himself the priest, himself the victim. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, Isaiah 53:5. Christ was treated as we deserve, that we might be treated as he deserves. He was condemned for our sins in which he had no share, that we might be justified by his righteousness in which we had no share. He suffered the death that was ours, that we might receive the life which was his. With his stripes we are healed. I invite you to open your heart to this Christ, this Jesus who forgives, this Jesus who delivers us from guilt, this Jesus who takes the burden of condemnation off our shoulders, this Jesus who not only pardons us from the guilt of the past, but delivers us from the power of sin in the present. This is the Christ that you'll read about in the book Desire of Ages. And I